Hi students, this next video is going to outline the Chapter 2 overview and also the chapter objectives. For the overview, refer to PowerPoint 2-2 or 2.2 in your book. The chapter examines individual characteristics including age, gender, race, ethnicity, and abilities, and how they influence employee performance, how managers can increase their awareness of these characteristics and better manage a diverse workforce. A lot of like what I said in the intro video. Now let's talk a little bit about the objectives. These objectives are essentially the learning outcomes of what we are trying to get out of the chapter. What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to absorb? And if you look at PowerPoint 2.3, you will see these objectives spelled out. And that first objective is to describe the two major forms of workforce diversity and give examples of how workplace diversity, discrimination, undermines diversity effectiveness. So essentially we're looking at what are the two major forms of workforce diversity, and the second thing is we want to give examples of how workplace discrimination undermines diversity effectiveness. Excuse me if I misworded the first time. The second objective is to identify the key biographical characteristics and describe how they are relevant to organizational behavior. The third one is to define intellectual ability and demonstrate how it's relevant to organizational behavior. The fourth thing is to contrast intellectual and physical ability. And finally, we want to describe how organizations manage diversity effectively. So those are the 5 objectives that you can pull from PowerPoint 2.3. So let's talk first about the first objective, and that is to look at the two major forms of diversity and identify the key biological characteristics and describe their relevance to organizational behavior. We want to look at intellectual capability and explore its relevance in OB. So how do we effectively manage a diverse workforce? If you were to go to your PowerPoint 2.4, it talks about diversity. And we want to first discuss the demographic characteristics of our workforce here in the United States. If we notice over the years, there's been a lot of change in what years ago, back in the 50s, was considered to be a predominantly white male managerial workforce. Today's workforce is much more gender balanced and it is multi-ethnic. If you were to compare to the 1950s and talk about gender, women today are much more likely to be employed full-time, have acquired more education, and allegedly earn wages comparable to those of men for doing similar jobs. Again, if you look over the past 50 years, the earnings gap between whites and other racial and ethnic groups have decreased significantly. Past differences between whites and Asians have disappeared or even have been reversed. So look at this permanent shift toward a diverse workforce as opposed to 50 years ago as we move into the 21st century. And what does that mean, a diverse workforce? It essentially means that organizations need to make diversity management a central component of their policies and practices. Look at PowerPoint 2.5. It looks at different levels of diversity. And let's try to look at the demographics a little bit. Mostly, the demographics today reflect what we refer to as surface level diversity. And the surface level diversity does not include any thoughts and feelings of any type, and can lead employees to perceive one another through stereotypes and assumptions. Basically what it means is, like, we put labels on people, and we really shouldn't do that. We assume that because they look a certain way or act a certain way, they're either some type of a threat to us, or they're not up to our standards. And these are the types of things that really need to disappear, and we still have a long way to go. However, though, evidence has shown that as people get to know one another, they become less concerned about demographic differences if they see themselves as sharing more important characteristics, such as personalities and values that represent what we move from surface level diversity to deep level diversity. So individual differences in personality and culture shape preferences for rewards, communication styles, reactions to gender, reactions to leaders, different ways to negotiate, come to a common ground, and many other aspects of behavior in organizations come to fruition. Now, the second thing we wanted to talk about in that first objective is when we get to discrimination. If you look at PowerPoint 2.6 and Exhibit 2-1 in your book, it talks about discrimination. And although diversity doesn't present many opportunities for organizations, effective diversity management means working to eliminate unfair discrimination. To discriminate is to note that there's a difference between things which in itself isn't necessarily bad. For example, noticing one employee is more qualified for making hiring decisions and noticing another is taking on leadership responsibilities exceptionally well is necessary for making promotional decisions. We have to really size things up for what they are and focus on the objectives and not on the label of a person. That's surface level diversity, and we got to go beyond the surface. Usually when we talk about discrimination, though, what we mean is allowing our behavior to be influenced by stereotyping certain groups of people. Rather than looking at their individual characteristics, unfair discrimination assumes everyone in a group is the same, and they are not the same. For example, if you look at Exhibit 2-1 in your book, it basically shows discrimination can occur in many ways, and its effects can be just as varied depending on the organizational context and the personal biases of its members. Examples, some forms of discrimination might be exclusion or incivility toward people because they belong to a certain group or demographic. And they're hard to rule out sometimes because sometimes they're not possible to observe in different situations, and they occur simply because the person that's doing it isn't even aware that they're doing it. And this becomes a problem. So whether these things are intentional or not, this type of discrimination can lead to a lot of serious or negative consequences for employers. It causes a decrease in morale, reduced productivity and citizenship behavior, and a lot of negative conflicts. It increases employee turnover. So unfair discrimination also leaves qualified job candidates out of initial promotions, and you can even get a lot of lawsuits, and the employer may not be aware of it because people are saying, you're discriminating against me, and they're not even, the employer isn't even aware that they're doing that, and it's very painful on both sides. It's very expensive, it causes morale problems, and could even cause a company to go out of business. So what we want to do is, through positive, diverse reinforcement, getting away from surface level discrimination and more getting into individuals being qualified based on their demographics and culture and what they bring to the table, not the way they are. It's covert to think otherwise. Recognizing diversity opportunities can lead to an effective diversity management program, ultimately to promote a better organization. That is the end of the first video. Please review and then reflect.